So she's back tonight with Sacred Stories. Also, I should add, I'm going to embarrass her, that I think she has a small fan following now after the first panel discussion.
I don't understand that. Okay.
She doesn't believe me, but she does. Anna is a shamanic practitioner and teacher who lives and practices in Seminole Heights. She specializes in soul retrieval, depossession, curse unraveling, clearing and ancestral healing, and generally anything that goes bump in the dark or keeps people from being their most badass selves. She has studied with brilliant teachers such as Sandra Ingerman, Betsy Bergstorm, and Dr. Sandra Harner of the Foundation for Shamanic Studies. She loves teaching people how to be spiritually empowered and supporting people in their sacred odysseys towards peace and wholeness. She is also an environmental and social justice activist with Extinction Rebellion who advocates for telling truth about climate crisis. She finds her shamanic practice and community key parts of dealing with climate crisis grief and remaining a resource for speaking truth to power and nonviolent direct actions of civil disobedience. Thank you, Anna. Would you take it away?
Everyone. So I'm glad to be here. I really enjoyed the first event in the series, not only as a speaker, but also just getting to be a participant and listen to other stories. So I'm really grateful to Rachel for creating this environment and this opportunity for all of us to come together. Especially in these days when it seems like there's a lot of distress and constant discord. I think these kinds of coming together and sharing of ideas and with thoughtful, curious people, to me, feels like a real gift. So thank you. So as Jenica shared in my introduction, I'm a shamanic practitioner and teacher. A lot of people are unfamiliar with shamanism, and that's a really big topic, but what I can share just very briefly is that shamanism is the world's oldest spiritual practice, and it uses a form of altered consciousness. Some people might say a trance, although that's not totally accurate, but as to go to the spiritual realms. And that can be done a couple of ways, usually through drumming, but also sometimes through visionary plants like ayahuasca. And also part of the practice is storytelling. So it's something I use in my practice with others. I tell stories all the time, and it's really a method of teaching. But also because there is an oral history, there are things that are being passed down. So in shamanism, there aren't necessarily like sacred shamanic texts like holy books like the Quran or the Bible. Although I do feel that the Bible is filled with lots of shamanic stories and that Jesus was probably one of the greatest shamans that ever lived, but that's a very different conversation. Not one we're having tonight, but hit me up another time. Anyways, but we do have things like cave paintings and other evidence of this spiritual practice from the very first peoples. So given the long history, there are many, many, many stories. But tonight, I want to focus and share what I feel is a fantastic story from the previous century, going back about 60 years or so. And it's about an atheist anthropologist who went into the wilderness, into the jungle, and came out a very different man. It's a story of how one man's belief system and worldview changed in one night. And this is the story of Michael Harner, and it is from his seminal book, The Way of the Shaman. And most of what I'm going to be sharing this evening is from the first part of this book, from chapter 1. So I'm going to paraphrase some of it, and I'm going to share some edited excerpts from the book, just for the sake of brevity. And also because this print is really tiny and the book is falling apart. So, anyways, so a bit of background. In the 50s, Harner was doing extended field work as an anthropologist studying indigenous people mainly in Ecuador and Peru, so from the Amazon to the Andes. And around 1960, he went on a year-long expedition on behalf of the, I think it was the American Museum of Natural History. So they asked him to go back, and he was super excited because he loved, being in that part of the world. So he had been there for the better part of a year, and his research was going really well. But he wasn't getting far with his attempts to learn about the Canibo people's religion. Despite them being very friendly and relatively open with him, they were just very reluctant to talk about their supernatural beliefs. So here's the part where he starts to recount what they finally said to him. If I really wish to learn, I must take the shaman's sacred drink made from ayahuasca, the soul vine. I agreed with both curiosity and trepidation, for they warned me that the experience would be very frightening. The next morning, my friend Tomas, the kind elder of the village, went into the forest to cut the vines. He told me to fast. He boiled the vines all afternoon and then left it to cool until sunset, when he said we would drink it. So then basically what happens is that the village prepares, and they muzzle the dogs, they get the kids all quiet, and they bring him, Michael Harner, to this communal house, and they gather around him. As Tomas gives him this bitter potion, which is also known as the Little Death, and you'll understand why they call that in a little bit. So they have him lie down on this mat in this communal house. They're around him. They give him the drink, and he starts to hallucinate fairly soon. And he starts hearing the sound of a waterfall, and it's getting louder and louder until it's all he can hear. His jaw starts to go numb. His temples start to go numb. And he starts seeing bright lights and colors and patterns. And then he finds himself in this kind of celestial-like cavern where there's these shadowy figures. And it's kind of like a funhouse scene, and things start to get really interesting. So going back to his recounting, as my eyes adjusted to the gloom, the scene resolved itself into something resembling a supernatural carnival of demons. In the center, presiding over the activities and looking directly at me, was a gigantic, grinning, crocodilian head from whose cavernous jaws gushed a torrential flood of water. The waters rose until the scene metamorphosed into a simple duality of blue sky above and sea below. All creatures had vanished. Then I began to see two strange boats floating through the air towards me. They slowly combined into a single vessel, not unlike that of a Viking ship. I became conscious of the most beautiful singing I have ever heard in my life, emanating from the voices on board. I could make out large numbers of people with the heads of blue jays and the bodies of humans, not unlike the bird-headed gods of ancient Egyptian tomb paintings. At the same time, some energy essence began to float from my chest up into the boat. Although I believed myself to be an atheist, I was completely certain that I was dying and that the bird-headed people had come to take my soul away on the boat. While the soul flow continued from my chest, I was aware that the extremities of my body were growing numb. My body slowly began to feel like it was turning into solid concrete. I could not move or speak. Gradually, as the numbness closed in on my chest, towards my heart, I tried to get my mouth to ask for help, to ask the villagers for an antidote. I could not make a word. I began to call my heart my friend, my dearest friend of all, to talk to it, to encourage it to beat with all the power remaining at my command. I became aware of my brain, and I felt physically that it was in separate and distinct levels, and that it was conscious of the condition of my body. Now I was virtually certain I was about to die. As I tried to accept my fate, an even lower portion of my brain began to transmit more visions and information. I was told that this new material that was being presented to me because I was dying and therefore safe to receive these revelations. These were secrets reserved for the dying and the dead, I was informed. I could only barely dimly perceive the givers of these thoughts, giant reptilian creatures, and I could only vaguely see them in what seemed to be the gloomy, dark depths. They then projected a visual scene in front of me. First, they showed me the planet Earth as it was eons ago, before there was any life on it. I saw an ocean, barren land, and a bright blue sky. Then black specks dropped from the sky by the hundreds and landed in front of me on the barren landscape. I could see that the specks were actually large, shiny black creatures with stubby pterodactyl-like wings and huge whale-like bodies. Their heads were not visible to me. They flopped down, utterly exhausted from their trip, resting for eons. They explained to me in a kind of thought language that they were fleeing from something out in space. They had come to Earth to escape their enemy. The creatures then showed me how they had created life on the planet in order to hide within the many forms and thus disguise their presence. Before me, the magnificence of plant and animal creation, hundreds of millions of years of activity, took place on a scale and with a vividness impossible to describe. I learned that the dragon-like creatures were thus inside all forms of life, including man. They were the true masters of humanity and the entire planet, they told me. We humans were but the receptacles and servants of these creatures. These revelations alternated with visions of the floating boat that had almost finished taking my soul on board. The boat with its blue jay-headed crew was gradually jarring away, pulling my life force along. I knew I had only a moment more to live. Strangely, I had no fear of the bird-headed people, but dreaded the dragon-like denizens of the depths. I suddenly felt my distinctive humanness, the contrast between my species and the ancient reptilian ancestors. I began to struggle against returning to the ancient ones, who were beginning to feel increasingly alien and possibly evil. With an unimaginable last effort, I barely said, "Medicine," to the villagers. I saw them rushing to make the antidote and knew they could not prepare it in time. I needed a guardian, and I frantically tried to conjure up a powerful being who could defeat dragons and protect me from alien reptilian creatures. One appeared before me, and at that moment, the villagers forced my mouth open and poured the antidote into me. Gradually, the dragons disappeared back into the lower depths. The soul boat was no more, and I relaxed with relief. The antidote radically eased my condition, but it did not prevent me from having many additional visions that were manageable and enjoyable. I made fabulous journeys out into the galaxy, and finally, I slept. Okay, so Harner wakes up the next morning feeling oddly refreshed and peaceful, and after he's given breakfast, he gets out his recorder, and he records the previous night's experience. But there's this one part that was blank, and he was really struggling, and he said that it felt like his mind, part of it had been erased, and so he knew that he just needed to get it, so he just wrestled it back from his consciousness, and when he finally brought it back, he realized it was all these communications from the dragon-like creatures, including the part of their role in the evolution and domination of all of life on Earth. And he was really excited that he was able to remember it, but he also felt really uneasy since he felt like he wasn't supposed to bring this information back. So he says, "I even had a peculiar fear for my safety because now I possessed a secret that the creatures had said was only for the dying. I immediately decided to share this knowledge with others so that the secret would not reside in me alone and my life would not be in jeopardy." So basically, he's freaking the fuck out. You know, he's this academic, and now he's losing his shit. And so he jumps in his little boat, and he goes up the river to this nearby American Christian mission station where he knows a couple named Bob and Millie. And so Bob and Millie apparently are pretty pragmatic, good people. And he describes them as like a cut above and that they're humorous and compassionate. And so he gets there by about noon and he gets to meet with his fellow Americans. And so he continues. I told them my story. When I described the reptile with the water gushing out of his mouth, they exchanged glances, reached for their Bible, and read to me the following line from chapter 12 in the book of Revelation. And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a floor. They explained to me that the word serpent was synonymous in the Bible with the words dragon and Satan. I went on with my narrative. When I came to the part about the dragon-like creatures fleeing an enemy somewhere beyond Earth and landing here to hide from their pursuers, Bob and Millie became excited and again read from the same passage in the book of Revelation. And there was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels with him. I listened with surprise and wonder. The missionaries in turn seemed to be awed by the fact that an atheist anthropologist, by taking the drink of witch doctors, could apparently have revealed to him some of the same holy material in the book of Revelations. When I had finished my account, I was relieved to have shared my new knowledge, but also exhausted. So I slept for a while and then returned to the village that evening. I had a pressure and a noise in my head, and I thought I was going mad. I was now eager to solicit a professional opinion for the most supernaturally knowledgeable of the Conibo, a blind shaman who had made many excursions into the spirit world with the aid of the ayahuasca drink. It seemed only proper that a blind man might be my guide to the world of darkness. I went to his hut and described my visions to him. At first, I told him only the highlights. Thus, when I came to the dragon-like creatures, I skipped their arrival from space and only said, there were these giant black animals, something like great bats, longer than the length of this house, who said that they were the true masters of the world. There is no word for dragon in their language, so giant bat was the closest I could come up with. He stared up toward me with his sightless eyes and said with a grin, oh, they're always saying that, but they are only the masters of the outer darkness. He waved his hand casually towards the sky. I felt a chill, for I had not yet told him that I had seen them coming from outer space. I was stunned. What I had experienced was already familiar to this barefoot blind shaman, known to him from his own explorations of the same hidden world into which I had ventured. From that moment on, I decided to learn everything I could about shamanism. And there was something more that encouraged me in my new quest. As I recounted my entire experience, he told me that he did not know of anyone who had encountered and learned so much on his first ayahuasca journey. You can surely become a master shaman, he said. All right, so Dr. Harner went on to dedicate his life to shamanism and to found with his wife, Dr. Sandra Harner, who I had the deep privilege of training with. Together they co-founded the Foundation for Shamanic Studies. And they created an organization that teaches the practice of core or cross-cultural shamanism. And it also supports indigenous shamans and preserves their knowledge. He is largely credited with bringing shamanism back to the West, where most contemporary people's connection to their shamanic ancestors was interrupted by organized religion, primarily Christianity. He died last year and leaves behind an incredible legacy. So, what I particularly enjoy about this story is the obvious irony of what happens when an academic who, in his attempts to learn more about the people he's studying, agrees to take part in an ayahuasca ceremony. I mean, it's purely for research. He doesn't have any intention of a supernatural or life-altering experience. He's just trying to understand the people better and to, potentially like make some inroads with them and gain some trust. But of course, the white academic, who you could say represents the colonizer, gets his ass handed to him in the most poetic way by the indigenous people and the mother vine, the soul vine, ayahuasca. And it opens him up to a way of understanding and seeing the world that he was completely ignorant of previously. He has an initiatory experience that wakes him up to a whole realm of knowing that he was blind to. And that a blind shaman sees this all is really beautiful and perfect irony. The other part of this that I really love is that it shows that there's this one story that is known to these two polar opposites, right? You got the missionary and then you've got the shaman. But their perspectives on it are very different. And we have this very dramatic written version in the Bible, and then we have a more casual, pragmatic, even joking version from the shaman. And what I find fascinating is that the story is known to seemingly opposites. There's this mainstream organized religion, and then there's the indigenous outsider shaman. And then there's this written historical account in a holy book, and then the personal account from direct experience. And then it's known to the atheist academic researcher, who is oddly the perfect vessel and bridge between the two. So there's a lot to unpack and reflect upon, I think, with this story. And obviously, we don't have the time to go in a lot of depth now. But I hope, if nothing else, that you found this entertaining. And maybe found it thought-provoking. Perhaps you will question your own version of stories and wonder what else you may learn if you are willing to suspend your own limitations or beliefs and open up to the great mystery. I think that's something we can all benefit from doing time to time. So, thank you.